When I was a child, something moved above my bedroom every night. Not footsteps, not animals. It only moved when the house was silent, and it stopped the moment I realized I was awake. Everyone told me it was nothing. They were wrong. Silence was never empty in the house on Cedar Hollow Road. At night it gathered weight, settling against the walls and sealing like damp air before a storm. I learned this when I was 9, lying awake in my bed, staring at the glow in the hallway that slipped under my door and barely touched the edge of my carpet. That was when the sound came. Not a bang, not footsteps. It was slower than that. Deliberate, measured, as if someone above me was carefully shifting their balance. A soft scrape, then a pause. Another scrape, patient and controlled. It came from the attic, directly over my bedroom, and only when everything else had gone quiet. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Even then, some part of me understood the rule. Whatever was up there listened as closely as I did. The first night I told my parents. My mother didn't look up from the sink. Water ran too loudly for a moment, then stopped, and the kitchen felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. I remember thinking the silence was waiting. "There's something in the attic," I said. My father folded his newspaper with care, as if sound itself needed to be controlled. He asked me what kind of something. An animal, maybe. Mice. The house was old. Houses made noise. I tried to explain the pattern, that it only happened late, that it stopped when I moved, or breathed too loudly, or turned on the lamp beside my bed, that it felt like it knew when I was awake. They exchanged the look adults use when they think a child is telling the truth emotionally, but not factually. My mother touched my hair, smiled tightly, and told me stress could make the mind play tricks. School had been hard, but Imeta needed rest. That night, the sound returned. I lay perfectly still, counting seconds between movements. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Each one pressed down on my chest. I imagined the attic floor bending, boards flexing under careful weight. I imagined hands. When my bedroom light clicked on, the attic went silent immediately. Not fading, not retreating, just gone. I stayed awake until morning, listening to nothing breathe. After that night, sleep became something fragile, like thin glass stretched over darkness. I learned quickly that the house behaved differently when I was awake. It listened. It adjusted. The noises from the attic were not random disturbances, not the careless movements of an animal trapped between beams and insulation. They followed rules. I discovered the first rule by accident. One night, after lying awake for what felt like hours, I shifted my leg beneath the blanket. The sound above me stopped instantly. No fading, no final scrape. Just absence. The sudden quiet pressed against my ears until they rang. I stayed still, my muscles aching, afraid that even swallowing might be enough to invite it back. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. When I relaxed only slightly, just enough to let my breathing deepen, the sound returned. Not aggressively, not angrily. It resumed as if it had merely been waiting for confirmation. That was when I understood. It reacted to awareness. From 10 on, I tested it the way children test dangerous things, carefully, obsessively, and alone. I held my breath. I opened my eyes. I shifted my weight. Each time, the sound responded with precise obedience, as if it had been watching me through the ceiling, reading my intentions instead of my movements. The attic floor above my room creaked in places I memorized by heart. I could tell where the sound was by how it traveled down the walls, by how the vibrations touched the light fixture. It stayed directly above my bed, never closer to the attic door, never near the edges of the house. Always centered, always above me. During the day, the house felt harmless. Sunlight softened the corners. Dust floated lazily in the air. The attic was just another storage space filled with boxers, old coats, broken furniture wrapped in yellowing plastic. My father showed me once, lifting the hatch and pulling down the ladder. He laughed as he climbed, his weight causing the same beams to groan I heard at night. See, nothing here. But the attic during the day felt wrong in a subtler way. The air was stale, heavy with insulation and age, but there were no footprints in the dust. No disturbed boxers, nothing out of place. It was too still, as if it knew better than to leave evidence while the sun was watching. That night, the sound came earlier than usual. I pretended to sleep. I didn't move. I didn't breathe deeply. I let fear crawl through my chest and settle there. Above me, something shifted its weight slowly, deliberately, as though adjusting itself for comfort. For the first time, I felt certain it was not alone up there. My parents started watching me instead of listening to me. They noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden quiet, the way I lingered in doorways as if waiting for permission to enter rooms that had never frightened me before. My mother scheduled a doctor's appointment. My father tightened loose boards and checked the attic insulation twice in 1 week. The doctor asked gentle questions. Did I feel scared at night? Did I have trouble at school? Did I ever hear things that others didn't? I learned which answers made adults uncomfortable and which ones made them nod with relief. I learned that fear was acceptable, but certainty was not. So I softened my words. I said I wasn't sure. I said maybe. I said it could just be noises. That night, the sound lasted longer than it ever had before. It moved with purpose, tracing slow paths above my ceiling, never straying far, but covering more space than usual. I could feel it, mapping the room beneath it, measuring, learning. I squeezed my eyes shut and imagined my parents asleep down the hall, unaware that something was pacing over their child with careful restraint. I wondered, briefly, if it ever went above their room. The thought felt wrong, like asking a question you already know the answer to. The following week, a police officer came to the house. He was tall and polite, and smelled faintly of coffee. He checked the locks, the windows, the attic access. He shined a flashlight into every dark corner and found nothing that justified my fear. When he smiled at me, it was the kind of smile meant to reassure, not to believe. Old houses make noise, he said. That night, the sound waited until after midnight. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between movements. They had grown more confident, less hesitant. Whatever restraint had kept it careful before was thinning. It no longer froze when I shifted slightly. It paused, adjusted, then continued. A new rule had been learned. Something brushed against the attic floor directly above my bed. Not scraping, not dragging, but pressing. The ceiling bowed. Almost Imperceptibly, dust drifted down and settled on my blanket. I did not move. I did not breathe. In that moment, I understood something that would stay with me long after we left that house. The sound was not trying to get into my room. It was making sure I stayed exactly where I was. The search of the attic happened on a Saturday morning, when sunlight filled the house and made everything look smaller than it did at night. My parents insisted I stay downstairs, but I sat on the bottom step of the staircase, close enough to hear every sound above me. The ladder unfolded with a familiar creak. My father climbed first, his weight heavy and careless, in a way that never happened after midnight. The attic responded the way it always had during the day, with ordinary noises, old wood complaining under pressure. Nothing precise, nothing controlled. Boxes were moved, old coats shaken out, flashlights swept across the beams. Nothing. When my father came back down, dust streaked across his forehead. He smiled with visible effort. My mother nodded, satisfied, already closing the subject in her mind. The attic was clean, safe, ordinary. That night, the sound did not come at all. I lay awake for hours, my body tense, waiting for it to resume. Midnight passed. Then 1, then 2. The silence felt artificial, stretched thin over something restless. I did not sleep. I watched the ceiling until my eyes burned. The second night was the same. No sound, no movement. Just the house settling naturally, harmless and empty. My parents relaxed. I did not. On the third night, the sound returned, but it was different. It began directly above my head. Not slow this time, but careful, as if correcting a mistake. The movements were smaller, tighter, confined to a narrow space. It no longer explored, it adjusted. I realized then that the attic search had not removed it. It had taught it where not to be. Over the following weeks, the house entered a strange calm. My parents spoke in lighter tones. The doctor appointments stopped. School continued. Life resumed its shape, and I learned how easily fear could be dismissed when it went quiet long enough. But the sound never left completely. It came less often, always late, always subtle. Sometimes it didn't immobile. Sometimes it pressed down just enough for me to feel it without hearing it. The ceiling above my bed became a boundary I watched obsessively, waiting for it to give way. I stopped trying to explain. I understood now that belief had limits, that some things could only exist if no one else acknowledged them. The attic. The calm did not last. It never does. The first sign was the silence changing again. It grew heavier, deeper, as if the house itself had begun holding its breath. Even during the day, rooms felt slightly wrong, their emptiness more pronounced. Sounds faded faster than they should have. Footsteps didn't echo the way I remembered. One afternoon, while my parents were out, I stood alone in my bedroom and listened. Nothing. No hum of distant traffic. No birds. No wind through the trees outside. The quiet pressed in from all sides, thick and deliberate. I felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. That night, the sound was closer than it had ever been. Not above the center of the room. Not hovering patiently. It moved to the edge of the attic floor, directly above the wall where my bed met the corner. The ceiling there was lower, weaker. I curled into myself, instinctively pulling away from that corner, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. The movement above me followed, adjusting its position, correcting the distance. For the first time, I felt certain it knew exactly where I was. The pressure increased. The ceiling creaked softly, not in protest, but in response. Dust fell in a thin stream, landing on my pillow, my hair, my face. I did not wipe it away. I waited for my parents to wake. They didn't. The sound remained until morning. When daylight came, it retreated completely, leaving no trace beyond a faint discoloration in the ceiling that my parents dismissed as an old water stain. My mother suggested my father agreed. That was when I understood the last rule. The house was not protecting me. It was protecting itself. Whatever lived above my room obeyed boundaries set not by fear, but by opportunity. It waited. It adapted. It learned how much pressure it could apply without being noticed, how long it could remain before someone might question it. I stopped sleeping in my bed after that. I tried the couch, the floor of my parents' room, the hallway. The sound did not follow. It stayed exactly where it had always been, waiting. The decision to move did not come because of me. My parents framed it as practicality. The house was old. Repairs were constant. My father's commute was long. My mother wanted something smaller, newer, easier to manage. When they discussed it at the kitchen table, their voices were calm, measured, relieved. The house on Cedar Hollow Road had become an inconvenience, nothing more. I listened from the hallway and felt something loosen inside my chest. The final weeks passed quickly. Boxers appeared in corners. Drawers were emptied. Familiar objects vanished into cardboard and tape. The house began to hollow out, room by room, and with each disappearance, the silence changed again. It grew attentive. On my last night there, my bedroom was nearly empty. The bed was gone, replaced by a thin mattress on the floor. My posters had been taken down, leaving pale rectangles on the walls where sunlight had never reached. The ceiling above me looked farther away without the furniture anchoring the room. The sound waited longer than it ever had before. I lay still, staring up, knowing this was the final time I would sleep beneath that attic. A strange calm settled over me. Not relief, but resignation. Whatever had been above me all those nights had not won exactly, but it had endured. Near dawn, it moved, slowly, carefully. Carefully. One final adjustment, directly above where my head rested on the mattress. There was no pressure this time. No dust. Just presence. A confirmation. I understood then that it was not angry. Not desperate. It did not need to follow me. It only needed to be remembered. The next morning, the house stood empty. Sunlight poured through uncovered windows. The attic hatch was sealed shut. The ceiling above my room showed no marks, no stains, nothing that hinted at the nights spent beneath it. As we drove away, I looked back once, watching the house shrink into the distance. It sat quietly at the end of the dead-end road, surrounded by trees, indistinguishable from any other home in the neighborhood. Years passed. Childhood folded into adolescence, then adulthood, the way it always does. New houses, new rooms, new ceilings. I learned how to sleep again, slowly, imperfectly. The sounds of other buildings were easy to dismiss. Pipes, neighbors, traffic. But silence never felt empty. At exactly the same hour each night, long after I stopped believing in coincidence, the pressure returned. Not above me, not in any room. Inside, it was the same weight, the same awareness, the same patient restraint, and with it came the certainty that distance meant nothing at all. Whatever had lived above my childhood bed had never needed the attic. It had only needed time. By the time I turned 32, silence had become my profession. I worked as an audio restoration technician in Pittsburgh, specializing in damaged archival recordings, old tapes pulled from basements, reels warped by heat and neglect, voices buried beneath decades of hiss and distortion. Most people thought of silence as absence. You know better. Silence was something you shaped, something you carved away carefully, revealing what had always been there beneath the noise. I was good at my job. Too good, according to some of my colleagues. I could isolate frequencies others missed. I could sense irregularities before software flagged them. Long sessions in the studio left me drained in ways I didn't know how to explain, but they also felt familiar, comforting, in a way that disturbed me. At night, I slept lightly. Apartments came and went. Different ceilings, different cities. The pressure always returned at the same hour. Subtle and internal, like a memory pressing against the inside of my skull. I learned to live with it the way people live with chronic pain, not by ignoring it, but by adjusting everything else around it. I told myself it was anxiety, residual childhood fear, a harmless echo. That explanation worked until the recording started changing. The first time, I thought it was a glitch. I was restoring a cassette tape from the early 1980s, a home recording of a family Christmas. Laughter, muffled music, the faint clink of dishes. Nothing unusual. As I filtered out the background noise, a low frequency emerged steady, controlled, almost rhythmic. It wasn't part of the original recording. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't intrusive. It existed in the same way the attic sounds had existed. Deliberate, restrained, aware. I muted the track. The pressure in my chest eased slightly. When I unmuted it, the sound resumed exactly where it had left off. I didn't report the anomaly. I finished the job, delivered the cleaned file, and told myself coincidence could still explain things I didn't want to examine too closely. That night, lying awake in my apartment, I felt it again. Not above me. Listening. After that, I began hearing it everywhere. Not in the world, never in traffic or crowds or rooms filled with human noise, but in recordings that should have been empty. Gaps between words, pauses between notes, spaces engineers usually ignored because nothing lived there. Something did. I started working longer hours, not out of ambition, but compulsion. Each restored file felt like a test. Each silence felt heavier than the last. The sound never repeated exactly, but its character remained consistent, controlled, patient, economical. It behaved like something conserving energy. I began cross-referencing timestamps without meaning to. Late-night recordings, early morning interviews, home tapes recorded when families thought nothing was happening. Patterns emerged, not in sound alone, but in absence. The quieter the environment, the clearer it became. One evening, while reviewing an old police interview from rural Pennsylvania, I noticed a familiar name in the metadata. Ashford. The town barely registered in my conscious mind, but my body reacted instantly. My shoulders tightened, my breathing slowed. I replayed the section repeatedly, isolating frequencies until the background noise fell away. There it was, the same restrained movement, the same patient adjustment, recorded unintentionally, years after I had left the house on Cedar Hollow Road. My hands shook as I paused the playback. The pressure inside me grew heavier than it had in years, no longer distant or vague. It felt directional now, as if something had finally aligned. I searched public records that night, old property reports, archived police visits, noise complaints, mental health referrals. Cedar Hollow Road appeared more often than it should have for a quiet dead-end street. Other children, other families, always the same pattern. Sounds dismissed, inspections that found nothing, moves explained by convenience, no recorded incidents violent enough to matter, except for the gaps. People forgot details. Testimonies contradicted themselves. Timelines blurred. Memory failed in oddly consistent ways. I understood then that the house had never been unique. It had been convenient. The sound did not belong to a place. Places simply made it easier to listen. That night, as I lay awake in my apartment, the pressure finally shifted outward. For the first time since childhood, it felt close to the surface of my skin, as if the distance between inside and outside had thinned. I did not pretend to sleep. I listened, and it listened back. I returned to Ashford in late October, when the trees had begun shedding their leaves in slow, tired spirals, and the sky seemed permanently overcast. The drive from Pittsburgh took less than 4 hours, but the distance felt deceptive, folding time in on itself until memory and present blurred together. The town had not changed the way cities do. It had simply aged. Storefronts looked familiar without being recognizable. The diner near Main Street still stood, though the sign had been replaced twice. Houses leaned into their foundations with a quiet resignation of structures that had survived more winters than they were built for. Cedar Hollow Road was still a dead end. I parked at the edge of it and sat in my car longer than necessary, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The pressure inside my chest had intensified during the drive, growing steadier with every mile, as if proximity mattered after all. The house was no longer there, or rather, it was, but not in the way memory demanded. The structure had been remodeled, expanded, painted a soft neutral color that erased its age. New windows reflected the gray sky. A different family's car sat in the driveway. For a moment, I wondered if I had been wrong, if my mind had exaggerated everything, if the sound had been nothing more than a child's fear calcified by time. Then the silence settled. It was unmistakable, the same attentive quiet, pressed flat against the world, waiting for conditions to align. The house hadn't changed that, it had adapted. I walked the length of the road slowly, noting how other homes sat just far enough apart to keep their occupants isolated. How the forest pressed close at the edges, swallowing sound. How easy it would be for something to exist here, unnoticed. At the end of the street, a man stood raking leaves. Older now, familiar in a way that tightened my throat. Officer Daniel Reeves. He recognized me before I spoke. His eyes lingered a moment too long, his smile restrained by something uneasy beneath it. We exchanged pleasantries. I told him I had lived here once. He nodded, as if confirming something he had never quite forgotten. I asked him if anyone had ever complained about noises. He hesitated. "Not officially," he said. That night, in the motel outside town, I did not sleep. The pressure did not remain internal. It filled the room with weight, pressing outward, testing boundaries. The silence vibrated faintly, as if strained by something just beneath its surface. I understood then that returning had been a mistake, but it was too late to leave. I returned to Cedar Hollow Road after midnight. The house stood dark and still, its windows blank, its presence subdued. I parked across the street and waited, listening. No movement, no sound. The silence felt rehearsed. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside without turning on the lights, guided by memory more than sight. The interior smelled different, cleaner. Newer, but the shape of the house remained unchanged beneath the renovations. Hallways still narrowed where they always had. Corners still caught sound. The pressure grew heavier with every step. I found my way to the room that had once been mine. The dimensions were slightly altered. The walls were painted, but the ceiling remained unchanged. I stood beneath it, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. I waited. The sound did not come from above. It came from within the silence itself. A subtle shift, a tightening, as if the room had begun paying attention. The pressure pressed down hard enough to make my vision blur. I understood, finally, what it had always wanted. Not entry, acknowledgement. The attic hatch was still there, tucked into the hallway ceiling. I pulled it open and climbed the ladder slowly, each rung creaking softly beneath my weight. The attic was empty, no boxers, no insulation disturbed. Just space. The silence up there was immense. It surrounded me completely, closing in until I could no longer tell where my thoughts ended. And it began. The pressure reached a breaking point, and with it came clarity. It had never been a presence in the attic. The attic had been a place where listening was unavoidable. I climbed back down and stood in the center of the room, looking up at the ceiling. I spoke not aloud, but with intention, with the part of myself that had learned to be still. The pressure eased. For the first time since childhood, the silence felt neutral. When I left the house, the street remained empty. The forest stood unmoving. The night offered no sign that anything had changed. But as I drove away, I understood the truth that had followed me all my life. The sound did not haunt places. It moved through people, and now that it had been heard fully, it no longer needed me to listen. I stayed in Ashford for 3 more days. I told myself it was to confirm patterns, to check records, to speak with people who had lived on Cedar Hollow Road before and after my family. In truth, I stayed because leaving felt like abandoning something unfinished. The pressure inside me had lessened after that night in the house, but it had not disappeared. It lingered, diffuse, as if spread thin across my awareness. Officer Reeves avoided me after our second conversation. The first had been cautious. The second was strained. I asked questions he did not want to answer, about past calls, about families who had moved suddenly, about reports that never made it into official logs. He admitted nothing directly, but his silence spoke with a familiar weight. "Some things don't escalate," he said carefully. "They just repeat." That sentence followed me. I visited the public library, combed through old newspapers, property transfers, zoning changes. Cedar Hollow Road appeared again and again at the edges of unrelated stories. Never central, never important enough to stand out, always adjacent to something missing. People described years of poor sleep, of tension they couldn't name, of relief when they left town that faded slowly, imperfectly. No one mentioned sounds. They mentioned quiet. On my final night, I returned to the edge of the forest near the dead end, standing where the trees pressed close to the road. The air was cold, still, expectant. I closed my eyes and listened on outward, but inward, the way I had learned to do over a lifetime. The pressure responded faintly, not as a presence, as an echo. I realized then that what I had mistaken for release was only redistribution. The sound no longer needed a single focus. It no longer required a child awake in bed beneath an attic. It had learned how to disperse. When I left Ashford the next morning, the town disappeared behind me without resistance. The road unfolded ahead, ordinary and unremarkable. The silence in the car was manageable, almost calm. Almost. Life resumed its shape again, as it always does. I returned to work. I answered emails. I restored recordings. On the surface, nothing had changed. Colleagues noticed I seemed more focused, less distracted. The pressure no longer peaked at the same hour each night. It no longer announced itself so clearly. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like integration. I began to notice how often people filled silence unnecessarily. How conversations rushed to avoid pauses. How rooms felt uneasy when nothing demanded attention. The sound, if it could still be called, that thrived in those moments, subtle and restrained, existing just below conscious recognition. I stopped isolating it in recordings. I understood now that extracting it, labeling it, treating it as an anomaly had been a mistake. The sound was not corruption. It was context. It existed to remind, not to intrude. One night, while restoring a nearly silent field recording from rural Ohio, I did nothing to the empty spaces. I let them remain intact. When the file finished exporting, the pressure eased more than it ever had before. Acceptance, I realized, was not surrender. It was accommodation. The silence that night was deep, but not hostile. I slept for hours without waking, dreaming of ceilings that no longer pressed downward, of rooms that did not require vigilance. In the morning, I noticed the faintest ringing in my ears. It did not fade. I understood what it meant. The sound no longer needed to wait. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is a condition. It is what remains when attention is nowhere else to go. Most people live their lives skimming its surface, protected by noise, by routine, by distraction. They believe silence begins and ends with what they can hear. They are wrong. Eat listens. Some children learn this early, lying awake beneath ceilings that feel too close, sensing patterns adults cannot afford to acknowledge. Most forget. A few carry it with them, mistaking it for anxiety, imagination, memory. I know better now. The sound never wanted to be discovered. It wanted to be normalized, to exist without resistance, to be woven so deeply into perception that it could no longer be separated from thought. If you are reading this in a quiet room, if you have felt the pressure shift as your attention lingered too long, understand this. Nothing followed you here. Nothing needs to. Silence does not move. It waits.